So, welcome to our weekly live. It is 12 p.m. on Friday, October 29th. The bells are playing, which means we are on the hour, which is a good reminder. And I'll be using my computer for notes and answering any comments that come up during the live ones while we're doing this. So if you see me glance down, it's just I'm checking what I'm going to say. So today's live is about your voice, and the reason I wanted to talk about this is because it's a really important part of teaching. It's a really important part of being a guide of yoga, a teacher of yoga, not yogurt, of yoga. And I think that especially if you're thinking about, well, not especially, but if you are thinking about a full-time career teaching, knowing how to maintain and support your voice is really important. But also, just as any teacher, the way that we maybe want to convey the energy of our classes and the things we would like to help our students support our students in feeling can come from our voice. So it might seem really obvious and it might be something that we think, oh, I don't really need to think about that. I can talk, so I can teach. And that is true to some degree. It's something that we're just naturally doing. I'm doing it right now. I'm just talking and sharing some stuff with you, and it really is as simple as that. However, in a yoga class situation, our voice is an integral part of the yoga practice. So along with our movements, along with the way that we demo poses, the words that we say and how we say them are communicating and guiding our students. And you might know from the training yourself what type of learner you are. So some of you will be kinesthetic learners, some of you will be visual learners, but there'll be a whole bunch of you who are auditory learners. And this is true in any yoga class that you're teaching. And so we work a lot on demoing to help those visual students and to some degree the kinesthetic students, sort of helping them experientially through the class. And the way that we're saying things, the words that we're choosing, and our voices are a way that we can help support the auditory learners in our yoga practices and our yoga classes. So today in this live, I just want to offer some things to consider. So just some things that you might think about in regards to your voice when teaching. And these are things that I've learned and discovered through my years of teaching, but also through my background as a singing teacher. So things that I have taken from that singing world and brought into my yoga practice and my yoga teaching. The one thing I want to say before we dive in is this is in no way meant to add stress to your practicum classes. So a lot of you will be working on your practicum classes now, especially if you're at the kind of planning, recording, practicing stage. So focus on the requirements for the practicum. Just be sure that we can hear you in the video. That's what we say in the instructions anyway. So not worry about that, but focus on that. And then maybe file these tips away for later, for the future. If you have the mental space and the time to consider them now, great, that's awesome. You could think about your voice in regards to your practicum class. But if you're feeling overwhelmed, just file this one away. And think about it a little bit later on. For your practicum class, the most important thing is that we can hear you. And these other tips and tricks that I'll offer, you may find them useful right now. It might be something that you decide to pause at this moment and just consider or maybe think about a later date if you choose to. So much of our teaching development happens when we're actually out there teaching. So a lot of these things just come with time and practice and experience, and that is true for lots of aspects of yoga. So here, I'm going to number them because it's easy to make a list when they're numbered. My vocal tips for teaching yoga. Number 1 is balance. So thinking about the balance between your speaking voice and the music you're playing, if any. So your playlist could be amazing, but if it's too loud that you're having to raise your voice, or that your students can't hear you very clearly, it might be time to consider just turning down the volume of that music, or changing the music maybe to something that's a little bit more background. It can be really, really tough to hear cues and to understand cues when your attention is sort of fighting between the voice and the music. And it can make a class quite difficult for students when they're not able to hear you because of that balance between the playlist, the music, and your voice. I think this is where, and I'm probably biased in this, but I like to use music that doesn't have words, because then that adds in like a third layer. When we have lyrics in there, our attention's sort of fighting to understand the words maybe, it's fighting to hear the music maybe, and it's fighting to hear the teacher's voice. So that's just my personal preference. You may find that you love having lyrics in your playlist for classes, and that's awesome. But the first thing to think about is balance. Am I having to use more energy than I need to? And are my students able to hear me clearly? Like, is my music background music? So it's not a party. Well, it might feel like a party, but it's not actually a party. Like, the music isn't the focus, it's something added to the practice. And lots of you might not use music for your classes. That's great too. But just thinking about the balance between music if you're choosing to use it. So the second thing is the space. So what is the space that you're teaching in? What is the size of the space that you're teaching in? Where are your students located in that space? So if it's a massive, massive hall, like a community center hall, there could be students way, way in the back. And can those students hear you? You may choose in a really, really big space to position yourself kind of at a midpoint in the room so that people are able to hear you even if they're in the back. Or you might need to use a little bit more of your vocal energy, so more projection, to be able to be heard if you are standing at the front. And then your voice is going to be a little bit louder for the people at the front than it will be at the back. So these are all things to sort of just note. When you're teaching yoga, you can, especially if you are like subbing or just kind of getting started and trying out different spaces, you can walk into a space and it's very different from the last place that you taught. So just having an understanding of how your voice travels in the space, what the acoustics are like in the space, can all make a difference as you're teaching. So just having that in mind as you sort of enter into the space is, what is this space like for my voice? So maybe arriving early and just taking a moment to speak in the space to see how you're heard. And it's always helpful to like get there early to try out the sound system too, if there is one, and just make sure that everything is hunky-dory for you. So the other thing about your voice to be mindful of is what's happening when you're demoing. So we might have the balance right, we might be totally dialed into the space and be comfortable with the space that we're in. And then when we're demoing poses, are we able to be heard? So being mindful of your voice when demoing is really important, because you could be in like a child's pose and maybe you're demoing child's pose 100% for your students, but maybe you're speaking down to your mat and you're not able to be heard. So you might need to find the balance between demoing something and then coming out of that demoing to speak to your students and to offer cues and suggestions. So an example of this is like downward dog. And how I do this when I teach is I cue my students and come into maybe downward dog the first few times so they know, especially if there's beginners. And I do try and have the beginners, if they're comfortable, a little closer to the front. Some of us as beginners might want to be right at the back, not seen. That's fine. But if they're comfortable, you might have them somewhere else in the room so they can hear you easily and see you easily. So coming into downward dog, I show the shape, and then I usually come onto my knees and offer some suggestions for my students as they're in their shape, or I stand up and walk around. And you can do this just with your words. So you could bring students into downward dog, cueing them in, and then you say, staying in downward dog, and then you can get up and move around so that they know, I'm staying here, I'm not following the teacher. Because sometimes maybe you've done it yourself, or you've been in a class and you've seen it where the teacher does something and everybody follows, or a few students follow, even if it's not an asana. I think I remember one time I was having people in mountain pose, and there was maybe 1 or 2 new students, and I just went to scratch my head because it was a little itchy, and then I saw the student do this, and then I thought, oh, I have to be way more clear on when I'm showing a pose and when I'm just being a normal human in a room. So finding that balance. Some other things, some other poses where you might think about that are child's pose, or like cobra, or anything you're sort of facing away. And then also being mindful of when you're demoing to flip around so that you're still projecting out to your students. You're not having your back face them. And that just depends on the setup of your mat, which is why some people like that crisscross, 2 mats, one on top of the other to make a cross shape. And then you can play around with how you're demoing so you're able to be heard. So just thinking about that when you're teaching kind of like people out there is, can I be heard when I'm demoing? So the next one is projection. And having an understanding of how to project your voice can be really, really helpful when you're teaching yoga. I can remember being in a restorative class with a teacher who I love dearly. One of my most favorite teachers who I studied with privately and really enjoyed spending time with them. They're a wonderful teacher and guide. However, in their restorative classes, in order to cultivate a sense of calm and quiet, her voice would become so quiet that I couldn't really hear her sometimes. And it sort of, the intention was to take you into this very quiet, still, meditative state. But I was straining so hard to hear in some classes just because of the noise and the city outside and all these other variables that I just couldn't hear. And I was like spending so much of my energy trying to understand what was being said because I really wanted to do what was being suggested. So there's a way to do that, and that is projection. So projecting your voice, there's maybe sometimes we might think that is just getting louder, and that is what's happening. But a projected voice can still carry that intention of calm and quiet, but it can be heard. So cultivating calm and quiet and those kind of qualities doesn't have to be with a voice that's sort of like this and sort of whispered and very soft. We can cultivate those qualities while speaking a little louder, and a lot of that just comes from our intention and our energy and how we're sort of pouring our energy and intention into the words. So this is like maybe the number one thing when you're teaching yoga in general, is just projecting your voice. And there'll be times when you want to energize your students and you'll project your voice in a way that's just sort of filled with energy and excitement, and it will get them going and maybe get them through the tougher parts of the class. And then there'll be times when you're projecting your voice and you're instilling this sort of calm, relaxing quality in the voice, and you're sort of embodying that yourself. And you maybe notice that I'm sort of lengthening out my words and taking nice deep breaths to help my students find that in themselves. And I'm not speaking in a whisper really. It's not sort of very soft. You can still hear me, but that intention is behind the words, and that's really what makes the difference. And so projecting your voice doesn't mean yelling. It just means being a little bit louder and cultivating that energy and that intention that you wish to create. Now behind this, there's how do we project is like number one, maybe question that sometimes comes up both in the yoga world and the singing world. And the answer to that is a couple of parts into how do you project your voice in a healthy, sustainable way. So the reason that I'm highlighting healthy, sustainable is because if you're teaching a lot of classes, or maybe you're just not used to speaking in front of people for an hour, you need to be able, just like you would with poses, to support and to help your voice to be able to do what it needs to do. The vehicle behind all of this is breath. So breath is the vehicle for sound. Breathing fully and deeply, as we do in yoga, gives you the fuel and the energy that you need to create the sound that you're looking to create. So to speak softly and to project, you need to breathe just as deeply and just as fully as if you wanted to speak with a lot of energy and excitement. So I remember learning that in my first singing classes as a kid, was that to sing quietly, in some cases, it takes more breath and more energy and more effort than it does to sing loud, because you're sort of taking in that deep breath, and then you're sort of fine-tuning it, you're sort of narrowing it down, and you're really, really placing it into a specific sort of region in your body. You're making it sort of really honed in, and then you're projecting it out, and that takes a lot of effort in the case of singing. In talking, it's not as much effort, but just because you're speaking quietly doesn't mean you don't need to breathe. If you're speaking quietly, or you're projecting that calm sense, that kind of like calming energy with your voice, you'll still need to take some deep breaths. You'll still need to use that breath and really, really let the sound travel on the breath to be able to send that out to your students. And then the same goes if you're wanting to have lots of energy and excitement in your voice, and you'll take a deep breath, and your students will hear you or see you breathing, and then they'll take a deep breath, and then your voice is just carrying that breath out with all that energy and all of that excitement and all of that joy. And that comes really from breathing. If there's no breath, there's no sound. So, and that's why knowing what you know about pranayama and what you know about yoga can be amazing for projecting your voice, because you're already in that space where you know how to take deep, relaxed breaths, and that you know how to use those breaths, which is maybe the big factor that lots of people miss. Is it's fine to take a deep breath, but then if you don't use any of that breath, we're sort of creating tension. So it's taking a deep breath and then using that breath to have that sound move out, to project, to create, to color, to paint this visual imagery for our students. And then we are done, and then we take another deep breath and we use that breath, and so on and so on. And this has the added benefit of being lovely and relaxing for you. So I like to think about teaching yoga when I'm breathing in this way. It sort of feels like a pranayama. So I sometimes wonder if that's why I feel so relaxed and great after teaching most yoga classes, is because I've breathed fully and deeply through speaking, and also by doing some of the shapes and by leading pranayama and meditation. But I think that the breath is a large part of that feeling after a yoga class. So the other part of this, so there's sort of three parts to projection. The other part is support. And you may wonder what support means for your voice. And you could just think of it like using certain muscles in your body to help support a yoga pose. So we might use abdominal support to help us in dolphin plank or in boat pose or something like that. So this is an area of contention and division in the classical singing world, is this idea of support. We're not going to go into that because it's not relevant and kind of complicated, but for the purposes of talking and projection, it's your breath. So supporting your voice with your breath and using that breath, just like I said, like actually letting that breath come out. This will help you not to get fatigued as you're teaching, and especially if you're teaching multiple classes a day. So again, it all comes down to breath. So, and support is taking a deep breath. And this breath is like filling my rib cage and using that breath as I'm speaking to help support my voice. Instead of, I think I'll try and do an example, but taking a deep breath in and then not really using that breath to help support. And I'm sort of holding it, and my voice gets kind of a little croaky and I feel tension in my belly. But if I take a deep breath and then I speak with that breath, I'm using that breath, I can feel it kind of the voice riding on the breath, and it's pouring out of me, and I can feel my rib cage starting to contract a little bit and draw inwards again. And then I'm going to be out of breath in probably a moment, so I'm going to take another deep breath. And then those are sort of the differences. And then the third thing is the intention. So we've got the breath. We know the breath is supporting us. We're going to use the breath. And then really, a lot of this just comes down to intention. So the intention of what you're trying to convey to your students with your voice. So if you're trying to energize and motivate your students, just thinking of that energy as you're speaking or before you're speaking. If you know that you're wanting to calm your students, then just thinking about that energy before you begin speaking or as you're speaking. And it's sort of, I think it's second nature to do this. It's very, very natural. But it's something to consider because we might not always be matching our intention with what we're saying or how we're saying it. And this is where the tool that can be uncomfortable for some, but so helpful, of recording yourself and listening back can make a big difference. Now, I don't like listening back to my voice or recordings, but it's probably the most helpful teaching tool that I've ever used. And I was sort of forced to when I began editing yoga videos, was to listen to myself. And I learned so much about my teaching from that practice. And you're so lucky because you get to do this before I did in some ways. You're able to do this during the planning of your first class as you record and maybe watch back your practicum and then record again, as I know some of you have done who've told me. And you'll hear your voice and you'll hear the inflection and the intention and the colors in your voice. And you'll be able to modify and to adapt as you desire. Maybe you love what you hear. Maybe you're like, didn't sound so calming as I guided Shavasana. I wonder if there's maybe something else I could try. So that's just something else to maybe think about and consider in terms of how we're projecting our voice. So are we projecting our voice with the right intention? And 9 times out of 10, if you've got the intention and the breath, you're good. There'll be nothing else to think about. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about before we wrap up this short live today was something called the vocal arc of a yoga class. So the vocal arc of your yoga class in many ways is going to follow the arc of your sequence. So generally in a yoga class, there's a point here. I find out. So we would say we're starting here, and this is the opening and the warm up. And then we slowly start to move a little more. We start to build maybe a little bit more heat and energy in the body. And then we get to standing poses and maybe, depending on the class, sun salutations, blah, blah. And then we get to, whether we're doing a peak pose or we get to sort of the climax of the class. And then we start to slowly cool down and to Shavasana and then to closing. And so it follows this kind of arc. Your voice will do the same thing. You'll start maybe, depending on the class you're teaching, but say it's like a gentle-ish hatha class, we're going to start our vocal energy sort of down here. So we're going to jump in all barrels blazing and have this, amazing, energetic, uplifted, joyful, excited voice. We're likely, if we're doing meditation at the beginning, we're going to have a calming sort of quality and essence to our voice. And as our students start moving, we'll be motivating them with our voice a little more. We'll be bringing more energy in, more support through to ourselves through our voice, but also to our students through what we're saying and how we're saying it. And then we're getting to that climax of the class, and then we start to come back down again. So it follows the same sort of sequence. And for me, that was really helpful when I thought about that movement, that arc, as to sort of the energy that I'm looking to cultivate in a class. And you can do this, your class might look a little bit more like humps, a couple of peaks or a couple of climaxes in the class, or it could really look quite different. But knowing that ahead of time can be helpful for some of us, just knowing that there is an energetic vocal arc to your class. And so the last thing I wanted to say is that it's normal to struggle with your voice, and it's totally normal to worry about being heard in a class. For many of us, this is a new endeavor. This is the first time we've stood up in front of people and had to say things for an hour, and it can be a little bit daunting. So if you find that you are a person who has trouble being heard, or just you're maybe a little shy about using your voice, my suggestion is to find a quiet space where you can't be heard. So this might be your home or somewhere else out in the middle of nowhere. And to sing, to hum, to yell, to get used to using your voice and to feeling your voice being used. This is a practice like everything else that we're doing. And it just takes time and a little bit of conscious effort, and you'll get used to making a little bit more sound. So if you're naturally a quiet person, then maybe taking some time to do this. The other thing that I like to do, which sounds kind of funny, but it does work, is if I'm in a space where I'm not sure if I can be heard or not, and I get really nervous and shy, is to put a towel around my mouth and to make sound into the towel. So the towel absorbs the sound. I'm not so worried about my neighbor hearing me or anybody sort of judging me as I do this, but then I'm able to sort of create sound and to get used to what it feels like to make a little bit more sound. So to get used to what it feels like to use my breath, to project my voice, to color my voice, to create with my voice. And I think that if you are in that group of people who are a little shy or maybe just naturally very, very quiet, just start doing it. Start speaking, start singing just for fun in the shower, start yelling. We don't yell enough, and yelling doesn't always have to be because we're angry. We can make these wonderful sounds because we're human and we have the ability to make big sounds and small sounds, and that's the range of our voice. And we sometimes don't know that we can do those things till we have permission. So my longtime singing teacher always used to tell me that singing is basically like pretty yelling, and that's really what it feels like when you're doing it. And knowing that it's okay to make that sound, once I had permission to make a lot of sound, I started to really, really enjoy it. So that's sort of it for me today for this live on tips to use your voice for teaching. And just to reiterate them again is think about the space, the balance in the space between the music and your voice, the size of the space, what you're doing when you're demoing. Can you be heard when you're demoing certain poses? And then we got into projection. So really using your voice, whether it's quiet or loud, through the breath, through the support of the breath, and through the intention of what you are trying to convey. And then we just talked a little bit about the vocal arc of a yoga class and how it sort of matches our sequence. So when maybe in your class you're going to need a little bit more energy because you're getting to the peak of the class, and when you might use that energy to cultivate a sense of calm because you're at the beginning or the end of your class. So that's it. Thank you so much for joining me. I'll take some time to see if there's any comments on there and you can keep commenting, and this will be posted on the Vimeo page for later watching if you don't see it on the Facebook. But if you're watching, then I'm guessing you're on the Facebook. So, but it will be there with all the other weekly lives that are on the Vimeo site as well, so you can check those out. So thank you, everybody. I hope you have a great rest of your day and your weekend, and I will see you all really soon. Bye.